I was asked to do a book for a series that Oxford University Press is publishing on great rights, inalienable rights. And I was asked to do a book on freedom of the press. And as I thought about it, and as I started to write this book, I realized more and more that what had happened in the last century in the United States under the First Amendment was the creation of something quite extraordinary in the world, in the history of the world. A degree of freedom unmatched anyplace else. A degree of celebration of the press and the role of the press in a free and democratic society. A series of doctrines that are very complex about the balance of interests of individual reputation or national security and a free and open press. But at its core, a celebration of a society committed to, as I put it, using New York Times versus Sullivan, of open debate that would be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. My earliest memories are connected to a newspaper. My father, who did not go to college, and when he came back from World War II, had worked before at a newspaper in Santa Rosa, California, and then went back to work. And my grandmother had worked at the same paper, which is now owned by the New York Times. And so he was circulation manager, and I knew how to fold newspapers and at a very early age and throw them and so on. And then he bought a small newspaper, daily newspaper in a small town in eastern Oregon. And I worked at the paper every day, developed films, was the janitor, did other things connected with this. And it was very much in my sort of my being. I also watched him struggle with writing editorials and taking on issues and working with journalists, and all of this led me, I think, to have enormous admiration for the press. Went to college, then went to law school, clerked, was a law clerk, and was fortunate to get a job as a law professor at age 27. When you come out of law school and you go into law teaching, you have no expertise, at least not when you're 27. And you have to write something, and the question was, what do I know about? And of course, I knew nothing about anything. So, but as I thought about it, I thought, I really do love newspapers and journalism. And I had worked on a case while clerking on the Supreme Court involving broadcast regulation, and that interested me. So I had some base there, plus this emotional identification with freedom of the press. And that really launched the course of my scholarly life. And once I became engrossed in these issues, I realized, as many people do with their own little specialties, that it was a wonderful way for learning about the world generally. The free and independent press that we have going into this new century was the product of several factors. One was a set of Supreme Court decisions that protected the press to a degree unknown in the world and unknown in human history. Another was a press that, through financial security, really becoming a monopoly in its line of business, developed profits that could then be deployed according to a spirit of journalism that emerged mid-century about serving the public good, about being the fourth estate, about having a role in democracy, serving the public interest in knowing. So money from monopolistic status could be used to these good public ends. And we defined a sense of journalism in the country that was also quite unique, the envy of the world. And I think a third thing was the development of public policies that reinforced the notion of the press as having a major structural public good role in the society. And those public policies really were most prominent in the regulation of broadcasting, which is a story, of course, completely unto itself in many ways. But the public interest principles of broadcast regulation, which began in 1927 and brought about the fairness doctrine, the equal time provision, lots of policies that encourage the press to be fair and open and independent. Those three things, I think, were crucial. Half the countries of the world have very repressive censorship, media regulation kind of laws and systems. So out of 193 countries, a good half of them are really in serious states of repression. On the other hand, you have half the states that are in pretty good shape. So it's sort of a glass half full, half empty situation. A second thing that is important is that the technologies are developing in such a way that they offer the opportunity to break down the repression. Now, I think it's a myth that the internet is going to end censorship or that satellite TV is going to end censorship. But there's no question that it's making censorship different, it's making it more difficult, and so on. I think a third factor is that we're in a period of contraction of coverage of global events, and that's because of the financial problems that the press is facing. So if you put all that together, you say, what are the things that can be done? Well, one is you can try to persuade or use international institutions or use international law to try to get countries to be more open. I think all of that is happening to a certain extent. It's important to support it. It's important to think about how we can build on that. So that's one thing. I think a second is we can, through public support especially, but also through other kinds of public policies, get the press to be more out there and to take advantage of the new technologies to make news available both to the United States and to the world. Nobody's in favor of censorship. Nobody's in favor of just being a propaganda piece, mouth for the state. Journalists want to be free, and it's really remarkable. I think it's also true that journalists feel unduly constrained, inappropriately constrained in their ability to cover. Part of it is financial. They want to write stories about China. If they're a foreign correspondent in Hong Kong for a major media publication, they want to write stories about it, but they find that their editors back home are not so willing to publish them. And the general answer that the editors give is it just won't support our bottom line. And so journalists around the world, I think, feel that there should be more reporting of the news about the world, say within the United States. I think another thing that's quite striking is the degree to which journalists feel vulnerable in the world. Vulnerable to censorship, but vulnerable to violence and to really serious forms of oppression. But to go back to the beginning, the striking thing to me is the degree to which journalists all over the world want to be free and independent and to report on what's happening. The report from the journalism school and Michael Schutzen and Leonard Downey and Nick Lemon sponsoring this as the dean of the school is really, I want to say, an outstanding example of the role that a professional school can play in taking one of the big questions of the time: how do you preserve a free and independent press in the society, and bring the best of academic and practical work and professional work to bear on trying to understand and recommend things for those issues. It's whatever you think of the report and the recommendations, I happen to admire it a great deal. It is exactly what a great school should do and a great journalism school should do. So the Downey-Schutzen report looks at this at a local level. Because of the decline in the coverage of local events, we are at risk of losing the information, the ideas, the knowledge we need in order to be effective politically, democratically. I'm trying to look at this at a global scale. And the problem I faced was at a moment when you need more and more information in order to cope with this rapidly changing world being driven primarily by economic forces. How do you set out to create the environment, the system in which that can happen? Break down the barriers to gathering news and reporting of news, and also develop the resources that are needed in order to cover that. We need information. We need to know what kind of institutions to set up, to support. We need to know what kind of policies to develop. We need to know how to understand and relate to other parts of the world. This has always been true. It's just more true now than it has been. It's going to be more true in the decades ahead. Universities are trying to figure out how to do that. We have a particular plan in mind for how to do it with these global research centers and other activities. The press also has to figure out how to do that, and we have to figure out how to help the press. We should face the fact that we are in a world in which we're going to have to compete on a global stage for our values. And if we believe that a free and independent press, very active, very capable of covering the world, if we believe that that's an important value, as I do, then we're going to have to think about how we help encourage that, because it's probably not going to happen if we leave all these choices simply to the market. I think it's very important to have a completely free and independent and privately funded press. I also think it's of great value to have a publicly funded portion of the press. And I think the benefits of both and the way they interact and the kind of values, journalistic values they bring to the table of journalism is great. And I think there's a kind of internal check and balance. If the government gets too controlling using their public funding of the press, the private media is always there to report on that and to serve as a check on it. And if the private media become too dependent on private funding like advertisers and are missing things because they are biased, the publicly funded media can step in and provide a counterexample or critique what's happening in the private media. So I think there are great benefits in having what I have called a dual system or a mixed system of the press. I think it's also important to realize, in thinking about public funding of the press, that we've had it for decades. It's not as if the question is, should we introduce public funding? We have had public funding of NPR and PBS, but also various kinds of implicit subsidies, even of the print media. So the question is, what kinds of public funding should there be? To what extent? Of what kinds of activities? I happen to think BBC, BBC World, BBC World Service are outstanding examples of of journalism. And I think they're also particularly admirable in the degrees to which they have engaged with the world, both in trying to bring a free and independent press to the world and also to bring that back to their country, to Britain. Very interesting that if you listen to NPR during the day, you will get a great deal of your international news, your global news, from both BBC World and BBC World Service, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. That's completely publicly funded broadcasting that we in the United States are getting courtesy of British citizens. I think many people seem to value that. I certainly do. I think at its core, I wanted to reflect my own journey of someone who spent many years trying to think about freedom of speech and freedom of the press in the context of the United States, and then realizing that the process of this country having done that over the course of the 20th century, in a way was going from a local kind of system to a national system of freedom of the press. And that given what's happening with globalization, we need now to think about those principles on a global scale. And not as a matter of human rights, but as a matter of practical creation of a global society. Because I think that's where we're headed. Not that there's a global government and so on, but clearly greater and greater interdependency that is very much in need of a free and independent press to be able to help that global society function effectively.